If you've been following the channel for a little bit, you probably know that my wife and I are renting this old house. It has a lot of quirks and oddities to it, and a lot of things are out of date, including our downstairs bathroom. In order to try to modernize it a little bit, I'm going to be building a corner shelving unit. The idea is that we have this little bit of corner space here, and we can use it to add a little bit of functional storage to this very small bathroom, as well as modernize it a little bit with the design. For the design, I'm going to be doing 3 2x2 select pine columns, as well as 5 quarter circle shelves made out of 1/2-inch plywood. I'm also going to be adding some birch edge banding around the plywood to finish it a little bit better, and I'm going to install self-leveling legs on the base of the unit, just in case the floor that it's ever on is not perfectly level. For the materials for this build, I'm going to be using some of a 4x8 1/2-inch birch plywood sheet. I also picked up 3 of these 2x2 select pine board columns from Home Depot. I only went with these because I already had one of these 2x2s, and I thought it would be cheaper and easier to just pick up 2 more to match. However, after sifting through 2 different Home Depot's entire selection of 2x2 pine boards, I can definitively say it was not easier and probably not cheaper than going with a hardwood supplier. I also picked up some edge banding on Amazon just to cover the edge of the exposed birch. And finally, for the feet, I picked up these cheap self-leveling feet on Amazon. The sum total for all of these materials came to just over $100. However, I'm only using a percentage of these materials, and the rest I will be able to keep for later projects. So after I did the math, the effective cost of this project comes to only about $20 worth of materials. And yes, most of the cost was in the 4x8 sheet of plywood. And yes, they did kind of laugh at me at the wood shop when I asked them if they could help me cut it down to size to fit in my Prius. But they were very helpful nonetheless. That's the plan, let's get to building.
So the first step in this long process is to cut down this 1/2-inch sheet of plywood into 13-inch squares. So to do that, I went ahead and I marked my 13 inches, and then I set up my table saw, tried to get it as square as possible, set up a roller, threw on my safety glasses, and got to ripping this down. I'm starting to get more practice ripping down plywood and bigger sheets, but since this is a contractor saw, ripping down large sheets like this is a little bit sus. But the more practice I get with it, the more confident I feel and the safer I will be. So I kept cutting until these were 13-inch squares, and I needed 5 of them. So with that done, I brought them back over to my workbench. The cuts were pretty good. I don't have a finishing blade on there, so there was a little bit of tear out on the sides, and that's why I'm sanding them down a little bit just to make them easier to handle. I hate getting splinters, and this quick step helps to reduce the chances of that. So now I'm going to go ahead and do this trick that I saw. I don't remember who I saw it from, but you basically hammer a nail into one corner of the board. I did it on what is going to be the bottom. And then you tie a string to a pencil, and that basically gives you a reference point to trace a perfect-ish circle. And it worked pretty well. I actually found that moving the board, not the pencil, ended up giving a better result, which is why I see 2 tracing marks here. But with that done, I brought that over to clamp it to the workbench to get to tracing it out. While I don't have a bandsaw, I do have a jigsaw, and while it's a little bit harder, I found that taking 2 passes made it fairly accurate, and on the second pass I tried to sneak up to that line to get it as accurate as possible, which worked pretty well. With that done, I brought it back over and used it as a template to trace onto the other boards the same arc, and I just went ahead and did that to every single one of the boards. Then I brought it back over, clamped up the boards, and got to cutting with the jigsaw. I sped it up for you here because it's kind of boring to watch, but in reality I was actually going really slow to try to be as accurate as possible. I'm pretty sure I could have done this with a router bit as well, but this worked fine. So after that bit of cutting, I was left with these 5 quarter circle boards. After giving them a quick sand, I headed over to double check in Fusion the measurements for my columns. I'm in no way sponsored by them, but it is really handy to be able to design files and then save them in the cloud, so in the shop I can double check. With the measurements confirmed, I went and tried to identify the straightest part of these 2x2 pine boards from Home Depot, which was a challenge. On this initial cut, I didn't try to get to the final height of the columns, I just tried to get close so I can sneak up on it later to be exact. With the columns cut, I then identified which side of the quarter circle boards I wanted to be facing up or down and marked them. Then, using a tape measure and my carpentry square, I carefully began to measure out the locations for my dado cuts. When I was designing this shelf, my wife and I decided that 12 inches between each board was a suitable distance for objects to be within them. However, because the boards themselves have a ½ inch of material, the effective distance between them is 11.5 inches. After the measurements were done on that first board, I took all 3 boards and clamped them together to use my carpentry square to trace those lines across all 3 boards. Precision here is really important because that's where the shelf's gonna go. So even though I forgot to film it, after this I took this whole contraption, still clamped, and brought it over to the miter saw where I trimmed off the ends to make sure that the columns would be exactly the same height and that the shelf dado cuts would line up. To make these 45-degree angle dado cuts, I built this sled out of some leftover poplar and plywood. I was really sick the day I built this, and it's not super interesting, so I just made this time lapse of me putting it together and trying to make sure everything was nice and square. Initially, my plan was to use it on the table saw as sort of a cross-cut sled, and that did work all right for smaller boards like you see me testing here. The idea is basically that I take a little bit of material away from the board with every single pass. However, with the table saw approach and using it like a cross-cut sled, that took a long time and it was hard to get accurate. So I eventually decided to take just this part of the jig and bring it over to the miter saw. I then took a little piece of scrap wood and tried to set the depth stop so that it would only take half of the board with each pass. After a little bit of adjustment, I was ready to start making some test cuts. So then I would make a cut, adjust the depth stop a little bit, and make the cut again until finally...
That is almost dead on.
Then I proceeded to finish out this dado cut using the test scrap piece of wood just to make sure that everything worked perfectly and that it would line up. And it did. Made a really nice dado cut, and the ½ inch piece of plywood went in pretty nicely. With the test done, I set up the actual column and got to cutting. And this took forever. I had to go slow to try to be as precise as possible. And also the blade I'm using is just a regular stock default blade that comes with the saw. It's not a dado stack or anything. But after 8 or 9 cuts, as you see there, the dado cut was complete and the ½ inch board fitted nicely. I then moved on to do this 101 more times, which I sped up for you here, but it took a long time. One of the things I did learn while doing this is that it's easier and better to first make your 2 exterior cuts on the dado cut and then take out the interior part after. That helps you be more accurate with your cuts. With the dado cuts and the columns done, I moved on to cutting the corners of the quarter circles at a 45-degree angle. I had already measured how far the interior of the dado cut was, so I was able then to just slot it in nicely, like that.
Oh yeah. We're cooking. We're cooking.
With the first shelf done, I just used it as a template and marked the other corners of all the other boards. With all of the cutting done, it was time to do a dry fit assembly. I would love to pretend like this was as easy as Legos coming together. However, this part of the process really revealed all of the inaccuracies in the cutting I made, as well as the bend and bow in any of the wood. And it took a lot of finagling to get this all put together. But after a lot of extra sanding and cutting and effort, it did.
Oh my gosh. Kind of works. That one's upside down, that one's upside down. They're all upside down. I installed them upside down.
flip. Really flip it. Okay. That's correct. Actually kind of helped. No way. It's level. In no world did I think these were going to be level. Let's take it apart. After the dry fit assembly, I did a little bit of sanding to the shelves to prep them and get rid of some of the pencil marks. I only used 80 grit, but I definitely should have gone up to at least 120, maybe higher. The glue up process for this was just as painful as the dry fit assembly, if not worse, and really demonstrated to me that precision in your cuts and the straightness of your boards has a massive effect on the assembly of your final product, obviously, duh. But eventually everything did start to fit together and I was able to start adding the glue. So following the glue up, this is what we're left with. Overall, I'm pretty pleased, actually. It's pretty level. I'm actually really shocked by that. I don't know why I thought it would just be totally askew and not fit together correctly. So the next step's gonna be to fill these holes as much as I can with wood filler and then sand it down a little bit, and then I'm gonna put edge banding on. Originally, I was planning on staining this with Danish oil. However, just because of the quality of the plywood in certain areas and a little bit of splitting here and there and the panel gaps in the back and stuff, not to mention all of the wood glue that has kind of gotten everywhere, and that would be really, really hard to sand away, I've opted just to paint this thing. So I'm gonna be using this Behr black evergreen matte spray paint. It's a nice dark forest green color, and it's gonna look really nice and complement some of the other decor in the bathroom. So time to prep it and then finish it. So I've never done edge banding before, and I would say that this process went okay. It wasn't hard to get it to match up perfectly, that was pretty easy, but I did run into a problem that the adhesive doesn't really like to stick to wood filler, which, as I say it, duh, sounds obvious, but I had not thought of that before I went and wood filled everything. So as I was ironing on and heating up the adhesive, I found that, especially around the corners, it was having trouble sticking. So any places where it didn't stick nicely, I would use a little bit of CA glue. The trimming process for this also didn't go great. I was just using a razor blade, and even though I did have a brand new blade in there, I ran into the problem of how do I keep the reference of the plywood at the same place on the edge banding where I want to cut it away. I did find that if I got too close to the plywood, then I could even start to carve into that. So I had to be very slow and careful. But even with all of that effort, I did accidentally make nicks here and there, and sometimes even into the plywood. I did eventually wise up and set the whole shelf down, which did help a lot, both with the ease of applying the adhesive as well as actually trimming the edge banding to size afterwards. This whole process was pretty long and laborious, but it was having a pretty good effect, and the more I did it, the better I got at it. I probably should have started at the bottom and gone up instead of starting at the top and going bottom, because my last one was definitely better than my first one, but eventually it was ready for paint. Once the paint was dry, I brought it back into the shop to go about installing the self-leveling feet. I've never installed feet like this before, but it's pretty easy. You just drill out holes for these inserts, and then the inserts have a threaded interior themselves, and then that just is what the bolt of the foot screws into. Installing the feet was the final step, and now we're ready for the grand reveal.
Well, there it is. I think it came out really well. I'm really happy with how it looks, both the color and the design. This was a pretty challenging build in terms of joinery, and my first time working with plywood, my first time working with dado joints, and my first time working with edge banding. If you look really closely, you can tell they're not perfect. But for bathroom furniture, I think it really elevates the space. It adds some really useful storage back in this nook, and it's probably the most functional thing that I've built so far. I learned a lot during this build, and I'm gonna continue to apply those principles to future builds. If you like this build, or you have thoughts about how it went, things I could have done better, please drop me a comment. Also, painting it, definitely the right call. I know originally I was gonna stain it, but this nice dark green looks great. It's also gonna look great on the t-shirts that I'm giving away. 3 free t-shirts if you wanna enter the competition celebrating 100 subscribers to the channel. If you didn't see that video, go check it out, enter the giveaway. It's gonna be running for about another week, so make sure you go enter. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give the video a like. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing if you'd like to see more woodworking content like this as I continue to learn and grow on my journey to become a better woodworker and creator. But that's it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. It's like a hobbit hole in here.